Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it a lot. My question is, you said that at the cross, all the signposts appear broken, but reading backwards, we find God present and active in the brokenness. My question is, how would you address confirmation bias and our predilection as human beings to look back and find meaning, even in irrational ways? So, thanks.
That's always going to be possible. Did you hear the question? We have a confirmation bias. We human beings want to find meaning, and we look back and we make meaning, and we tell stories about our past. This is what you're saying, isn't it? In order to try to give us a stable place on which to stand. Yeah, that's always possible. I'm not advocating the kind of foundationalist, rational epistemology which would leave you with something approaching mathematical certainty. Maths matters, but actually truth is bigger than that. And it's one of the funny things about truth, that however you conceive or construct it, whether it's correspondence or coherence or what, it always seems to be a bit more elusive. It's a bit bigger. And in the New Testament, that becomes clear that all the other sorts of truth matter, but ultimately truth is personal. And it's only when we realize that when we read Jesus saying, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life," we actually see what he means. If we take that within our normal rationalist world, we think it just sounds a bit silly and big-headed almost. But there's something going on there which transcends the ways we normally look at things. And that's why I've said that the notion of love, and love as the ultimate mode of knowing, is really so important. And again, the danger is that we in our modern world hear that and we think of it as simply the romantic half of the rational versus romantic either or. And certainly in the New Testament, it's much, much bigger than that. Because love is a mode of knowing in which I allow that which is known to be completely itself or herself or himself, while nevertheless delighting in it. So it's neither objective nor subjective. It goes beyond that. And then the other thing is that, of course, I believe this is public truth. It's not simply a fantasy into which I can enter and in which one or two other people can enter, and we just sort of share this fantasy. It's something which makes sense of the world. And it's when you read the great stories of people like, some of us were talking earlier today about Martin Luther King or Dietrich Bonhoeffer or people like that you say, actually, if there is any truth in the world, it's found in a life like that. Where did that life come from? It came from this sort of thing. So yes, it is always possible to be deceived, but that doesn't mean that there isn't actually the larger truth which we can enter. And then it's not so much, truth is not something that then you get to put in your pocket and keep as though you own it. It is the larger thing which then owns you. And that's both exciting and scary. Yeah, thank you. Please make a line at the microphones if you want. Yeah, thank you.
How do these 7 signposts connect to our understanding of evangelism, especially in your book, Simply Good News, how you talk about the gospel as good news, not good advice, and these seem like more things that we would live out rather than maybe announce. And I know I'm not supposed to do this, but do these connect at any way to Charles Taylor's Echoes of Eternity, your 7 signposts? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure at this time of night I could do the riff which would connect it up with Charles Taylor, but thanks, I will go back and have a look at that. Is that in a secular age? Yeah. Yes, I like what Taylor does, but as I say, there will be too many odd bits of stitching to make it work. But in terms of evangelism is a funny thing because it varies from culture to culture and always has done. And as I think I said at one point, the ultimate evangelism is the whole Christian community living the life which it's meant to live, making it obvious to a world which wasn't expecting this kind of thing, that the idea of being genuinely human involves caring for other people, involves looking after the brokenhearted and the weak and the afflicted and so on. The church has always done that at its best, and even sometimes when it's not necessarily been at its best, that's been part of the church's DNA, helping the poor. And so people have said, why are you doing this? And then people have said, well, it's because we follow somebody called Jesus who actually did this and this and this and died and rose again. How does that work? But among the things it means that we are now people who live like this. And it's that entire context of evangelism which makes the sense to people. They relate it. Now, that's not to say that evangelism can't happen with a 5-minute conversation with a stranger on a train. There are many, many stories where that's happened, where somebody has just said a few words and the stranger has gone away and thought, oh my goodness, something's going on. And so that happens too. But in my book, Surprised by Hope, I've argued that the church should flank evangelism proper, i.e. telling people that the crucified and risen Jesus is the Lord of the world, with justice and beauty, because the message of Jesus is about God putting the world right. And if the church is seen to be not caring about the world being put right, then we're falsifying the message. Likewise, the message of Jesus is about the God who made this beautiful and powerful world, making it over again in the most glorious, multiple way imagining. And if we are telling the story of Jesus but flanking it with kitsch and rubbish in our churches and our music and our aesthetics, then we shouldn't be surprised if the message doesn't actually mean what it's supposed to mean. So there's all sorts of lessons to learn from that. As we learn those lessons, then the 7 signposts, we realize this lesson we're learning about this person called Jesus fits with so many other things which were there as question marks in our lives, but which now come rushing together. That will be the point. So that's the kind of retrospective validation. Let's go to that mic over there.
I wonder if a bit of slang has made it across the water. Have you ever heard of a man crush? That bit I'm asking for a friend. That's unrelated. No, I can't help but wonder, when you give us the kinds of words that you do, speaking plainly about suffering, have you yourself ever had to grapple your way through a dark night of the soul?
Yes. I've written briefly about that in 1 or 2 places. Happily, it's not my main temperament. But I suspect anyone of my age, especially if you've had a family life and you've lived through the 60s, 70s, 80s, etc., there have been really difficult times. And those who are close to me know about that. My spiritual director knows really quite a lot about that. And quite a bit of it isn't stuff I would readily share, except with, in a good space, on a wise day, with a good drink. But yes, and when I read Psalm 88, for instance, or that bit in Romans 8 about groaning in prayer when we don't know what to pray for, in despair as it seems, then I know about that. Thank you.
I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on the, epistemological nature of your proposed natural theology and how it would differentiate from something like a hard presuppositionalism. Because if I remember correctly, I believe I've seen you critique presuppositionalism in its hardline form in several other places. But I'm curious if you can just point out the differences between that.
Could you be so kind to those listening as to explain what a hardline presuppositionalism might be on a November evening?
So it would be like assuming the truth of Christianity, regardless of evidence, regardless of historical information, regardless of philosophical argumentation or anything, just assuming it and saying this is the only way the world makes sense. So it seems like what you're saying is you build this theology based on the fact of the resurrection and the crucifixion. So in a bit of like evidential theology in there, as opposed to just only presupposing everything. I'm just wondering if there's a difference there.
Yeah, there's several things which would need teasing out there, and it would be fun were this an academic seminar with 20 people rather than an evening lecture with slightly more than that, to go around the tracks and sort of nail them all down. And obviously I can't do that. It seems to me that if I've understood what you mean by evidential presuppositionalism, then it seems to me that would be a kind of a rationalist way of doing something like what I was doing, but the rationalism would be getting in the way all the time. And instead, what I'm trying to say is that we really do know that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. This is a historical piece of evidence, a fact, if you like, which is as much a natural phenomenon as the sun rising in terms of something we can study in the natural world. But when we try to make sense of that event, when we see what it seems to have meant even for the Roman soldiers who were involved, not just with Christian hindsight, then we find that it resonates with other big questions that all human beings have cross-culturally and over time. Questions about truth and beauty and justice, etc., etc. So that there's a kind of a groundswell which isn't a matter of adding A plus B plus C in a rationalistic manner, and there we've got it, but which then goes around and perhaps more like music than mathematics, actually does make sense. I mean, of course, the big question is what counts as sense and who says, whose justice, which rationality, whose sense. But so that, yes, I would not want to go into the kind of the kind of view that you mentioned, and I think mine would differ from that. What I haven't done tonight at all, I haven't tried to because it would be a whole other lecture, was to show how what we can know about Jesus' resurrection and what we definitely know about Jesus' crucifixion make the sense they make in relation to one another. That's why I quoted Ludwig Wittgenstein's extraordinary dictum that it is love that believes the resurrection. And I'm not sure that Wittgenstein ever explained what he meant by it, but I think what he may have meant by it is that love is a larger mode of knowing which reaches out and finds itself being grasped by the possibility of a larger world, a newer creation, in which something we know wouldn't make sense within the old creation, namely the raising of somebody dead to new bodily life, might actually make sense, and with it, then you would get retrospectively everything else. Now, that may be the best I can do at this time of night, but I hope that's a start anyway. Yes, there's another question here. Thank you.
So my understanding of natural theology is kind of like a Ravi Zacharias approach to morality or natural law, that it's a way to rationally prove the existence of God without ever bringing the Bible into the conversation or bringing in the divine. And one thing I'm trying to understand with your lecture tonight is that it hinges on the cross. And as a Christian, of course, I buy that. But if I'm having this conversation with an atheist who carte blanche objects to any existence of religion whatsoever, or any existence of God, by looking at the cross, aren't I just bringing the divine right back into the conversation?
You could be, and this is something which I wasn't trying to address tonight because it would require several other bits and pieces. And where what I gave you tonight, started off life was after quite a lot of other explorations. And I'm not at all trying to do the sort of thing that Ravi Zacharias would do. I'm not knocking what he does because I know it's extremely helpful. I know a lot of people who've worked with him and with that system. Fine, go for it. But that's never been the way I would approach things. And one of the things I've tried to say here and elsewhere is that the normal quest for natural theology, which has come to us from the 18th and 19th century particularly, has been heavily conditioned by many cultural and philosophical things that have happened within Western culture. Of course, natural theology goes back to the Stoics and so on before the time of Jesus. People called it something similar anyway, and they've been trying to do that. And in a sense, all great worldviews have a sort of to and fro between what they may imagine about the gods. Even atheists, in a sense, do a natural theology because they say we can look at the world and we can show it's a completely closed system and it doesn't need anything else from anywhere else. That too is a form of natural theology. What I think I would object to, having contextualized the modern quest for natural theology and modern biblical studies within particularly the German world of philosophy in the 18th and 19th centuries, is then to say that we have to reframe the question and allow it to be reframed by all sorts of other things that were systematically screened out culturally over the last 200 or 300 years. And that when we do that, we find the sort of questions that I've allowed to emerge here. And particularly, I haven't gone into this tonight, I just hinted at it. But within the first century Jewish world, the idea of God's world and our world, of heaven and earth, if you like, are not a long way apart from one another. The temple is the symbol of the fact that they're meant to overlap and interlock. That's the cosmological framework within which this might mean what it means. Now, that was more or less a closed book in the 18th and 19th centuries, including to many, many devout Christians. They still thought of heaven as a long way upstairs. They merely used a Platonic version of Christianity to try to get there. And I think that has been disastrous and still is disastrous. The other thing I would say is that precisely our modern word religion is leading us seriously astray here, because what I was talking about was actually more like culture, the culture of a society in which we know that beauty and truth and freedom and so on matter. Most people wouldn't say those are particularly religious concepts. I'm starting with things which are universal human aspirations, instincts, vocations, and then saying that when you look at the story of Jesus' crucifixion as a denial of justice, as a stamping on freedom, etc., isn't it interesting that it actually maps onto those 7 vocations? And then you have to say, what's going on? Was this just an odd coincidence? And of course, at any point, people can say, this is just an odd coincidence. Like when I listen to the most stunning piece of music, somebody else might just say, oh, it was just a great cacophony and a caterwauling and I couldn't make sense of it. But actually, if you know anything about music, you realize there was a beauty and a power there. So I'm not saying that you end up with a rationalist proof which would leave you saying to an atheist that either you're wicked or stupid or both. Because this is not the hermeneutic of love. That's mere rationalism. I want to transcend that. This is a much longer conversation which I'm trying to shrink. Yeah, okay, thank you. Ma'am, another female voice. Yes, good.
This is not quite on the subject of this evening's presentation, but I didn't want to lose the chance to ask you, what about evil? What kind of God allows infants and babies to suffer and injustice to go on all over the world? Tell me what we're dealing with here.
Yeah, the cop-out answer is I wrote a little book a few years ago called Evil and the Justice of God, and I know there are copies of it in this room because I signed one earlier, so they may be even for sale at the back. Yeah, they are for sale at the back. And because it's a sensitive topic, obviously, and it's got, in a sense, worse over the last 3 centuries as we become more aware of all the things that happen in the world. And it took this huge leap forward in 1755 with the Lisbon earthquake, which Voltaire, the great French thinker, made a great play of. What kind of a God would allow that? Everyone's in church and the buildings fall on top of them, etc., etc. It's interesting because theologians from the beginning, Jewish and Christian, have known about earthquakes, natural disasters, people dying young, horrible accidents, etc. This is not a new thing that we have just discovered. But it's interesting that in the last 200 or 300 years, in Western thought, the so-called problem of evil has loomed larger for us than it did for our forebears. I don't think because they were insensitive. I think because we have framed questions in a particular philosophical way, and in particular, one of the default modes of modern Western world in general, particularly America, is deism. And in deism, God may be removed from the place, but he's still supposed to be the CEO who's supposed to be pressing the buttons and making things happen, and then we blame him when they don't. And then when we look at other ways of conceiving reality, not least the Jewish way, we discover that, yes, the Jewish scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament, are full of people saying what's going on, but the problem doesn't come out the same way that it does for us. That's why we find it difficult to understand the book of Job, for instance. So this isn't answering your question, but the short answer to the question, as well as go read the book, is that from the 18th century onwards, people separated out, as I think I said, the question of the philosophical problem of evil, if there's a good God, why is there evil, from the question of atonement, about the cross dealing with our sin. And I think that's wrong. I think there is something about the crucifixion which also speaks very powerfully and sub-articulately, actually, to the idea of God making a world that is other than himself, which is an act of extraordinary love, which is a world that by definition, since it's a creation of love, he is not going to control like a puppet master. That doesn't mean it's out of his control entirely. It's just that it's different from the sort of mechanistic model that we've often operated with, and that God takes responsibility for that world, and the crucifixion is the moment ultimately where that happens. And I think the four Gospels telling the story of Jesus going to the cross, I think it's one of the things that they're talking about, the accumulated evil of the world gathering together and blowing itself out, as it were, on Jesus. So now it means something different. It's a great question. It's a dark mystery. I think one of the things to realize about evil is that if there is a good God who has made a world which is in principle good and is to be put straight at last, we should expect not fully to understand evil. If there was a good answer to the problem of evil, it would mean we had belittled it. Evil is a wicked intruder in God's world, and the best we can do is to stand at the foot of the cross and say, perhaps God has himself taken responsibility for it. But anyway, please read the book, and thank you for a great question. There's two more people, and maybe we just have time for those two questions. Yes, thank you.
Hi. A lot of my thoughts center on missions and cross-cultural ministry. So these signposts that you have highlighted, would you say that they're emphasized differently or in different cultures? Ideas of justice or...
Yeah, I see. You'd have to be an extraordinary wide-ranging cultural critic to be quite sure about the answer to that. My sense, having studied some bits of some cultures, like ancient Greek or whatever, I find it's remarkable that human beings in so many different cultures do come up with the big questions about justice and beauty and spirituality and so on. Did you have a sense that there might be some slippage there if we joggled that around a bit?
No, I just wanted your opinion if different cultures emphasize different signposts or resonated with different ones to a different degree.
That might be so. I read a lot of poetry, and I read poetry from different contexts, and I'm fascinated when I find radically different expressions of basically the same deep human problems. And this is why, for instance, Shakespeare's plays speak right across cultures, and they've been translated very successfully into languages around the world. They raise the great human issues, and which are the ones I've mentioned. Thank you. Yes, final question, ma'am.
Hi, excuse me. So you made mention about how someone can listen to a great masterpiece of music and not get anything from it, but someone who is a Christian may get something more out of it. Would you say that these signposts, when Christians experience them, they're experiencing the truest form of them, and that they really are seeing God, or people who are not Christians are experiencing God but not realizing it, or not experiencing the truest form of these signposts? Or could you explain a little more about that?
Probably all of the above. Human love is wonderful and richly complex, and none of us get more than some of it some of the time. That's one of the reasons that being human should be such fun, but it can also be so scary and often so tragic and sad that there's a sense of possibilities which we miss out on. And yes, to be sure, many people who would not own any form of Christian faith, when you listen to what they say and read what they write and see what they do, they obviously have amazingly profound insight into some of these things which the rest of us would do well to learn from. My argument would never be that Christians somehow collectively get all these things a bit more right than everybody else, but that however much struggling you are as a Christian with faith, and the struggles that we have are not necessarily because we don't have the right sort of faith. There are 1,000 things in our background, in our upbringing, in our psyches, which can make it very difficult for us to resonate with some of the things that ideally it would be nice to resonate with. So it's a matter of then seeing that Jesus in the middle of the picture, which is where it's all at, actually does then make sense of all these other things. And this is not bringing a supernatural Jesus in to be a deus ex machina to trump the natural theological argument. It's saying, look at Jesus as a figure of history. It's one of the fascinating things. natural theology was getting going at the same time as the so-called quest for the historical Jesus was getting going. And the people who were doing that at the beginning were very careful to say Jesus was just a human being, a Jewish leader who got it all wrong, etc. And I would say, okay, let's look at Jesus as a Jewish leader who gets it all wrong and dies on a cross. Now, that seems to be a failure of justice, beauty, spirituality, etc., etc. Guess what? That seems to meet all these other things that we're all aware of. Isn't that odd? Now let's start from there and see what happens. So having come full circle, thank you very much for that question. I think, yes.